Cornelia Ashford, Duchess of Ashford, pressed herself against the terrace doors as though she might dissolve into the velvet curtains. Her gown, once a masterpiece of ivory, satin, and seed pearls, hung from her shoulders like a shroud, the boned bodice gaping where flesh had wasted away. Her collarbone jutted, sharp as carved marble beneath translucent skin. In her gloved hand, a champagne flute trembled, the golden liquid untouched, mocking her with its effervescence. She had not eaten in 3 weeks. Not since the morning she attempted to take breakfast in her morning room and found herself unable to swallow past the thickness of shame. Not since she realized that every morsel felt like complicity in her own continued existence in existence society had deemed unworthy of sustenance. 3 weeks, I've heard, came a voice like rustling taffeta. Lady Pemberton's stage whisper carried perfectly across the ballroom's careful acoustics. Not a single morsel has passed her lips. The shame drove her appetite clean away. Lady Hartwick responded, her fan snapping open with surgical precision. Poor creature, though one might argue it's her own fault for not knowing what manner of man she demarried. Tragic. Certainly, Lady Pemberton's smile was all teeth, but perhaps deserved. Cornelia's fingers tightened on the flute. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flee. 6 months had passed since the young Duke of Ashford, her husband of barely 2 years, had been found dead in his mistress's apartments, his heart having failed him at the gaming tables. 6 months since society discovered he'd mortgaged every acre, sold every heirloom, squandered a fortune 3 centuries in the making on cards and courtesans in champagne. 6 months since Cornelia became not a grieving widow, but a cautionary tale. The debts were monstrous. The shame was worse. In London, that glittering serpent fed upon both with exquisite appetite. She lifted the champagne toward her lips, a performance of normalcy, but her throat constricted. The glass returned to her side, still full, still damning faint. Then the whispers stopped. The sudden silence rippled through the ballroom like a stone dropped in still water. Heads turned, fans froze, mid-flutter. Even the orchestra seemed to soften, as though the very air had drawn breath. Alexander Thornhill, Duke of Greystone, stood at the ballroom's entrance. He was a man carved from granite in winter storm stall, broad-shouldered, his evening clothes immaculate, but somehow lacking the preening vanity of younger men. Silver threaded through dark hair at his temples, and his face bore the weathered dignity of 45 years lived with purpose. A scar traced his left jaw, a souvenir from Waterloo, and his eyes pale gray, almost colorless, swept the room with the assessing gaze of a commander surveying a battlefield. He had not attended a London ball in 7 years. Not since his wife died, bringing their stillborn son into a world that had no mercy for such grief. Society had whispered then, too, about his retreat to his country estate, his refusal to remarry, his transformation from decorated war hero to reclusive hermit. But even in absence, Greystone commanded respect. Key's fortune was vast, his reputation unassailable, his presence undeniable. Those pale eyes found Cornelia across the crowded room. She felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing, not pitying, not cruel, but searingly present. He saw her. Not the scandal, not the ghost, but her. The woman drowning in silence, while society applauded her sinking. He moved. Each footfall echoed, despite the music, despite the murmuring crowd. He walked with military precision, his path unwavering, directly toward the corner where she tried to make herself invisible. Matrons gasped. Gentlemen straightened. The ballroom held its collective breath as the Duke of Greystone stopped before the ruined Duchess of Ashford and executed. A bow of such perfect formality, it could only be interpreted as deliberate respect. Your Grace, his voice was midnight velvet, low enough that only she could hear its slight roughness. Would you do me the honor of this dance? Cornelia's world tilted. The champagne flute nearly slipped from her grasp. Around them, she felt, rather than saw, the shock rippling outward, Lady Pemberton's fan snapping shut. Lady Hartwig's intake of breath, 100 pairs of eyes widening in scandalized delight. "My lord," she whispered, her voice cracking from disuse, "I am not fit for such kindness." Greystone's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those winter-gray eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or shared understanding of what it meant to be judged and found wanting by a world that had never bled as they had bled. "Then it is society that is unfit, madame," he said quietly, extending his gloved hand. "Not you." She stared at that outstretched hand as though it were salvation itself. Her own hand rose hesitant, trembling, and placed itself in his palm. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, steadying the tremor. He led her onto the floor. The orchestra, reading the room's electric tension, surged into a waltz. His hand settled at her waist, and she felt how carefully he supported her weight, how his strength became her scaffolding. They began to turn beneath the chandeliers, and Cornelia realized with a shock that bordered on pain. She had forgotten what it felt like to be held as though she mattered. "When did you last eat, Duchess?" His question was barely audible beneath the music. Her throat closed. She couldn't answer. His tears burned behind her eyes, and she fought them with every shred of dignity she still possessed. His hand tightened fractionally at her waist. "Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock, my residence, a private supper. No audience, no judgment." The waltz ended. He released her, bowed again with that same deliberate formality, and before she could find words, pressed something small into her gloved palm. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the center of the ballroom, while whispers erupted like wildfire around her. Cornelia looked down at her trembling hand. A calling card, heavy cream stock, bore his address in bold script, but it was the words written on the reverse that made her breath catch. "Courage, your grace, you are not forgotten." The rain came at dusk, pattering against the windows of Greystone House like whispered secrets. Cornelia sat in the hired carriage outside the residence for a full 3 minutes before she could force herself to descend. Her gloved hands knotted so tightly in her lap that her knuckles ached. She had worn a veil dark, concealing, though she knew it made her look more guilty than discreet. But the thought of being seen entering a gentleman's home alone after dark was almost enough to turn the carriage around. Almost. The card in her reticule seemed to burn through the fabric. "Courage, your grace." She had read those words perhaps 100 times since last night, tracing the bold strokes of ink as though they were a talisman against the void that had been consuming her from within. The butler who answered her knock was elderly, dignified, and utterly unsurprised by her arrival. He took her damp cloak without comment and led her through corridors that smelled of beeswax and old books, past closed doors and silent rooms, until they reached a chamber at the rear of the house. Firelight flickered beyond the threshold. The butler opened the door, bowed, and departed without a word. Cornelia stepped inside and stopped. The room was small and intimate, rather than grand, with walls lined in dark wood and windows curtained against the night. A fire burned in the grate, casting dancing shadows across a table set for two. But it was not the opulent feast she'd half expected, not the overwhelming display that would have shamed her inability to eat. Instead, the table held simple, honest food: warm bread, still steaming from the oven, roasted chicken with herbs, vegetables, glazed golden with butter, and a small apple tart that looked like something from a country kitchen rather than a London chef's pretension. Greystone stood when she entered, in the sight of him in shirt-sleeves, no jacket, no cravat, just the simple white linen and dark waistcoat of a man in his own home, felt shockingly intimate. He moved to pull out her chair himself, his movements economical and certain. "No servants," he said, as though reading the question in her eyes. "No witnesses. Tonight, you are simply a woman who deserves to eat in peace." She sat because her legs would no longer hold her. The chair was warm from its proximity to the fire. Greystone took his seat across from her and began serving the food with his own hand, slicing chicken, arranging vegetables, placing bread on her plate with the focused attention of a man performing a sacred duty. But Cornelia stared at the food as though it were an accusation. Her hands remained in her lap. The smell of roasted meat made her stomach clench with something between hunger and revulsion, and she felt the familiar tightness in her throat, the one that had made swallowing impossible for weeks. "I cannot," she whispered. Greystone set down the serving fork. He leaned back in his chair and studied her with those pale, penetrating eyes, not judging, not pitying, simply seeing. Then he began to speak. "7 years ago," he said quietly, "my wife died in childbirth. The child our son died with her. I had been at war for 6 years prior, surviving battles that should have killed me a dozen times over. And I came home to find that peace was more lethal than any French cannon." His voice was steady, but something raw moved beneath it. "For 2 years after, I barely ate, barely slept, barely lived. Food tasted like ash. Every meal felt like a betrayal. How dare I nourish myself when they were gone?" Cornelia's eyes lifted to his face. He was looking at the fire, his profile sharp in the flickering light. "I understand what it is to be hollowed out by loss and cruelty," he continued. "I understand what it is to feel unworthy of nourishment. My sister finally told me that I was not honoring them by dying slowly, or simply letting grief win." He turned to her then, and the understanding in his gaze nearly broke her. "You have been dying to satisfy their judgment, Duchess, but their cruelty does not deserve that sacrifice." Cornelia's hand trembled as she reached for the bread. She tore a small piece, the crust crackling softly. Lifting it to her lips felt like lifting a mountain. She took a bite. The taste exploded across her tongue, butter and salt and yeast, simple and perfect. Her throat tried to close. She forced herself to swallow. Then another bite, and another. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and unstoppable. She couldn't tell if they were grief or relief or some desperate combination of both. Greystone did not look away. He did not offer empty comfort. He simply witnessed her, and somehow that made it bearable. "You are braver than any soldier I've commanded," he murmured. She ate more slowly, trembling, but eating. The chicken. A forkful of glazed carrots. The food settled in her stomach like an anchor, grounding her back into her own body. Color began to seep into her vision, as though the world had been gray and was only now remembering its hues. They talked as she ate. About books he loved, naval histories. She preferred poetry. About music, they both mourned the loss of Mozart's later works. About the maddening hypocrisy of a society that valued appearance over substance, performance over truth. His voice was deep and measured, and she found herself leaning toward it as though toward warmth. "They will gossip about tonight," he said as the meal drew to a close. "They will call it improper, scandalous. Let them. You have been dying in silence to please them. What has their approval cost you?" Everything, she wanted to say, but the word wouldn't come. Before she left, he placed a small, leather-bound journal in her hands. The leather was soft, well-made, the pages thick and inviting. "Write," he said. "Write what you cannot say aloud. When you are ready, if you choose, share it with me. Hope earn it, but write. Give your voice somewhere to exist, even if only on paper." She opened the cover. In his bold hand, "To the Duchess who endures." The tears came again, but she smiled through them, a fragile, genuine thing. She left through the rain-soaked night, clutching the journal like a lifeline. Behind her, Greystone stood in the doorway, watching her carriage disappear, his sister's voice sharp from the shadows. "Brother, do you know what you've done? Society will crucify you both." His jaw tightened. Let them try. The next morning, Cornelia woke to scandal sheets slipped beneath her door, lines screaming of secret assignations and fallen virtue. But atop the papers lay a single white rose, its petals perfect and pure, and a note in that now familiar script: "Meet me, the gardens at Kensington, noon. We face this together." Kensington Gardens bloomed with spring's reckless promise that noon. Cherry blossoms drifting like pink snow across manicured paths where London's elite paraded their respectability. Cornelia arrived, veiled again, her heart a caged bird battering against her ribs. She expected emptiness. Surely he had reconsidered this madness. Surely the morning's headlines had restored his senses. The scandal sheets had been vicious, so wore Duke's questionable charity and a widowess desperate gambit printed in ink, still wet with malice. But Greystone stood beneath a flowering cherry tree, solid as stone, waiting. He wore no expression of regret. When she approached on trembling legs, he extended his arm with the same deliberate formality he'd shown in the ballroom, and his voice carried that unshakable certainty that had first arrested her attention. "Walk with me, Duchess, in daylight, where they all may see." Her hand hovered above his sleeve. "They will destroy you. They will try." His gray eyes held hers. "Let them see that I choose you. Let them see that their cruelty holds no power here." She placed her hand on his arm, and together they stepped onto the main promenade. The effect was instantaneous. Conversations died mid-sentence. Matrons clutched their parasols like weapons. Gentlemen's eyebrows climbed toward their hairlines. A young woman gasped so loudly her companion had to steady her. The whispers began a series of scandalized delight that followed them like a malevolent tide. But Cornelia's steps grew steadier with each yard they covered. Greystone's presence beside her was an anchor, his pace measured and unhurried, as though they had every right to exist in this space, as though her shame were merely society's delusion rather than her fundamental truth. "You're eating again," he said quietly, for her ears alone. "Last night, this morning, small things, but..." She paused, surprised by the tremor of hope in her own voice. His hand covered hers briefly where it rested on his sleeve. Good. They had nearly completed the circuit when Lady Pemberton materialized before them like an elegantly dressed viper, flanked by her usual coterie of venomous companions. Her smile was all practiced concern, her eyes chips of malicious ice. "Your Grace," she addressed Greystone with exaggerated deference before turning that poisonous smile on Cornelia. "And your Grace, how unexpected to see you abroad, though I suppose even charity cases require fresh air." Her fan snapped open. "How kind of the Duke to take such pity on you, dear. One does admire Christian generosity, even when it borders on the theatrical." The women behind her tittered like trained birds. Cornelia felt her carefully rebuilt composure beginning to fracture. The old instinct rose to apologize, to shrink, to disappear. Her hand started to withdraw from Greystone's arm. His other hand covered hers, holding it in place. Then he stepped forward, and something in his bearing transformed. The affable gentleman vanished, replaced by the decorated commander who had led men through artillery fire and emerged victorious. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the path with parade ground clarity. "Lady Pemberton, you mistake compassion for pity and courage for weakness." Each word was precisely articulated, meant to be heard by every gossip within 50 yards. The Duchess has survived what would have destroyed lesser souls. She inherited a catastrophe not of her making and bore society's venom with grace you could never comprehend. She endured public humiliation while maintaining her dignity. She faced financial ruin without begging. She weathered scandal without retaliation. He paused, his gaze sweeping the gathered crowd. "If choosing her company makes me unconventional, then I shall wear that badge with considerable pride. And if my respect for genuine character over hollow propriety offends your delicate sensibilities, Lady Pemberton, then I encourage you to direct your attention elsewhere." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Pemberton's face cycled through shock outrage, and finally a mottled flush that clashed spectacularly with her rose silk gown. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned on her heel and swept away, with her entourage scattering like startled geese. Greystone offered his arm again. Cornelia took it, and this time her hand did not tremble. They walked to a secluded corner where wisteria draped purple curtains over a stone bench. Away from prying eyes, Greystone turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. The touch, even through gloves, felt like a covenant. "Cornelia," he said the first time he'd used her given name, and it sounded like music in his rough velvet voice. "I did not plan this. I did not seek to care for someone again, but watching you fight to simply exist. You've awakened something I thought I'd buried with my wife, Alexander," she whispered, testing his name on her tongue. "I am broken. I'm scandal itself. Then we are both shattered," he interrupted gently, "and perhaps that is precisely why we understand each other. See, I don't want you despite your brokenness, Cornelia. I want you because you survived it, because you're still here, still fighting, still capable of taking bread from a stranger's hand and choosing to live." He cupped her face with careful reverence, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "May I kiss you?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. She could refuse, could step back, could protect what remained of her reputation. But looking into those winter-grayed eyes, she realized she was exhausted from protecting things that had never truly protected her. "Yes," she breathed. His kiss was tender and desperate in equal measure, the kiss of two people who had learned that life was finite and precious and not to be wasted on fear. When they parted, she was smiling through tears, and he was looking at her as though she was something rare and irreplaceable. That evening, invitations arrived across London on heavy cream stock, sealed with a Greystone crest. The Duke would host a ball, his first in 7 years. Attendance was expected. And when Cornelia arrived that night in emerald silk that fit her properly for the first time in months, Greystone met her at the entrance and led her through doors that opened onto her new life. While society held its breath and decided whether to follow or be left behind in the darkness of its own making.